From the forbidden case files of old New England, the Shadow Farm. Lance Hughes sat back in his worn-out leather chair, the springs creaking under his weight as he surveyed his modest office. Dust motes drifted lazily in the afternoon sunlight, filtering through the grimy window. The place was a far cry from the glamorous detective offices you read about in pulp magazines. His was a rundown affair above his Aunt Jenny's coffee shop diner on the corner of Pickman Street and West Street in Arkham, Massachusetts. The pervasive scent of frying bacon wafted up from below, mingling with the cloying remnants of his last cigarette, creating a miasma that seemed to cling to the peeling wallpaper like the whispers of forgotten secrets. His desk, a chaotic jumble of yellowing files, outdated newspapers, and coffee-stained mugs, bore the heavy burden of too many cold cases that seemed as dead as the embers in his ashtray. The worn calendar on the wall marked the relentless march of days, each one a step closer to the inevitable reckoning with Aunt Jenny and the rent he could no longer ignore. The pressing weight of overdue bills gnawed at him like a ravenous spectre, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Lance tapped a pencil on the edge of the desk, the rhythmic tapping echoing in the oppressive silence. Business had been agonizingly slow, the kind of slow that drives a man to contemplate desperate measures. No one had darkened his doorstep in weeks, and his tab at O'Malley's bar was growing like a malevolent fungus. Even Aunt Jenny's patience, something he had always taken for granted, was fraying with each missed payment. He stared at the calendar, a silent plea in his heart for a miracle, for something, anything, that could stave off the inevitable. As if in answer, a sharp, decisive thud interrupted his brooding. His eyes darted to the door, where a large manila envelope now lay, freshly deposited through the mail slot. Intrigued, Lance pushed himself up from the chair, the springs releasing a groan like the lament of a weary soul, and crossed the room. The envelope was heavy in his hands, its contents shifting with a quiet menace as he turned it over. The return address caught his eye: Frank Staples, a fellow detective based in the far-flung, shadowed corners of Indianapolis, Indiana. Now what could old Frank be sending me? Lance muttered, more to the ghosts that haunted his office than to himself, as he carefully tore open the envelope. Inside, he found a neatly typed report, a couple of faded photographs, and a handwritten note. With a growing sense of unease, he unfolded the note first. Lance, I know you've got a taste for the strange, so when this case crossed my desk, I couldn't help but think of you. It's a simple enough matter on the surface, deciding who gets the old Hendrickson farm out in Liston, Indiana. But as I dug deeper, well, let's just say I found something that might be right up your alley. The place has a history, and not the kind that sits well in broad daylight. Thought you'd like to take a look? Best, Frank. Lance's eyebrow arched in curiosity. Frank wasn't prone to exaggeration, and if he thought this was worth Lance's time, then it likely was. He settled back into his chair, the creaking springs mirroring the tension that now hung in the room, and lit a fresh cigarette as he began to read the report. The Hendrickson farm, it seemed, had been a fixture in the family for generations, passed down from father to son in an unbroken line of stewardship. But with the death of the last Hendrickson, Jacob, the farm was thrust into a legal limbo. No will had been left behind, and the land now waited in uneasy silence for the courts to determine its fate. Frank had been hired to trace the lineage and identify the rightful heir, a routine job, or so it seemed at first glance. But as Frank dug into the family history, the mundane began to twist into something far darker. The farm had always been an isolated place, self-sufficient and distant from the prying eyes of the town, yet according to local legend, it was also cursed. Frank's report detailed the accounts of neighbors and townsfolk, whispers of strange lights that flickered like will-o'-the-wisps in the fields at night, unnatural shadows that slithered through the woods, and the mysterious, gruesome deaths of livestock, their bodies discovered in grotesque, unholy contortions that defied any rational explanation. Lance leaned forward, the cigarette smoldering between his fingers as he pored over the pages. One name recurred throughout Frank's notes: Orville Hendrickson, Jacob's great-grandfather. Orville was a man shrouded in darkness, a recluse who rarely left the farm. In the late 1800s, rumors had circulated about his secretive practices, tales of occult rituals and forbidden pacts with ancient, nameless forces best left undisturbed. But it was one particular incident that snared Lance's attention. Orville had reportedly constructed a peculiar stone circle in the woods behind the farmhouse, a ring of ancient stones that no crops would grow near and that animals shunned with an instinctive terror. Locals avoided the place, claiming it was a thin spot, a place where the veil between worlds was gossamer thin, where the air was thick with whispers of things not meant for mortal ears. Frank's report included a photograph of the stone circle, taken in the early 1900s. The black and white image showed a clearing deep in the woods, with a series of weathered stones arranged in a crude, ominous ring. The trees that bordered the clearing seemed to recoil from the stones, their gnarled branches twisted as if in pain, straining to escape the corruption that seeped from the earth. But what sent a shiver of primal fear down Lance's spine was the shadow in the center of the circle, a shadow that did not belong to any earthly being. It was a dark, indistinct form, vaguely humanoid but grotesquely distorted, its limbs elongated and twisted in ways that mocked the natural order. Frank's final note in the report was brief but chilling. Locals say the place is still there, untouched by time, but those who visit it don't come back the same. A cold dread curled in Lance's gut, a primal fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind. This was no ordinary case, no simple matter of legal inheritance. Something far older and more malevolent lurked beneath the surface, something that had drawn Frank into its orbit, and now, by proxy, it was reaching for Lance as well. The weight of the unknown pressed down on him, a palpable, suffocating force. He put the report down, his mind racing. Frank had been right. This was exactly the kind of thing that fascinated him, that drove him to take on cases others wouldn't touch. But it was also the kind of thing that could easily get a man in over his head. The thought of the farm, of that shadow in the stone circle, tugged at something deep within him, a morbid curiosity, a need to understand, even if understanding meant risking his sanity. Lance stubbed out his cigarette and stood up, his resolve hardening. He needed to know more, to dig deeper into the Hendrickson farm's dark past. Perhaps it was time to pay a visit to Liston, Indiana. As he reached for his coat, the door to his office creaked open. Mary, the young waitress from the diner below, stood in the doorway, her face etched with concern. "Lance, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her voice soft, as if afraid to disturb the shadows that clung to him. Lance managed a small, weary smile. "Just an old friend sending me something to chew on, Mary. Something interesting." She hesitated, her gaze lingering on him as if searching for signs of the darkness she sensed but could not see. "Well, if you need anything, just holler. And, don't forget Aunt Jenny's waiting on that rent." "I won't forget," Lance replied, though his mind was already far away. His thoughts consumed by the grim, isolated farm in Indiana, where shadows whispered secrets best left buried. As Mary departed, Lance picked up the photograph again, his eyes drawn once more to the shadow in the stone circle. A part of him knew, deep in his bones, that he was about to step into something dangerous, something that would change him forever. But that was the nature of his work. He didn't just chase shadows, he lived among them. And so, with the report tucked under his arm, and the photograph burning in his mind like a cursed brand, Lance Hughes locked his office door and descended the narrow, creaking stairs, the weight of the unknown pressing ever more heavily on his shoulders. He had a feeling this case would be different from the others. This time the shadows weren't just following him, they were calling his name. End Part 1. Continued in Chapter 2 of The Shadow Farm.